Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I am excited. Jean, I don't know when the last time you have been on the show that I have hosted, but it feels like forever.
It does.
I'm excited to have Jean Mahan, my colleague, back to join me today. She's a former financial aid officer at both Tufts and Quinsigamond Community College. And I will say what I say every time. I love saying that word. I don't know why. It makes it fun. All right, Jean, we are talking about borrowing for college, and a common theme amongst all of us is we just don't want people to borrow any more than they have to and to not get in over their heads, right?
So true.
So to that end, we have a whole segment today about thinking through borrowing before you do it. And I guess there's, you're sitting down, you get the bill, and you're thinking, well, I don't have enough money to write the check for this amount right now. I guess I'll borrow. But it shouldn't necessarily be the first thing you think about, correct?
Exactly. I am in love with tuition payment plans. I call them the unsung heroes of college finance. And so most colleges have these opportunities where you pay a setup fee. It's usually pretty modest. And you pay over either 6, 8, or 10 months. You choose the amount. So maybe you know that you're getting a raise, or you're getting a bonus, or you've got a car loan that will be paid off. And in a few months, you'll have $2,000 or $4,000 over the course of the school year that you can put towards this. It allows you to break up those payments interest-free over those few months. So, if for example, you were able to put $4,000 a year on a payment plan, you've saved $16,000 in borrowing over the course of 4 years, not to mention the origination fees and the interest. So I always tell people, just really look at your budget, see what's going to be ending. Think about all those expenses your child takes away with them when they leave, their appetites, their friends' appetites, sports, activities, possibly car insurance if they're more than 100 miles away. And then you might have enough money to free up to use a payment plan.
Right. And to at least cover more of it in a payment plan.
Right.
Because you're spreading it out rather than having to have that money right then.
Yep.
So when you think about how much you need to borrow, right, that's another, I think you kind of just covered it a little bit when you're talking about, think about where you might have some free resources, but, how do you decide how much you need to borrow, I guess?
So one of the tricky things about this is that when a school tells you how much you're eligible to borrow, for a parent anyway, they're telling you the amount, including indirect costs, which are things like books and supplies and personal and transportation. And maybe you don't need to borrow for that. Maybe your student is working over the summer. Maybe you've got some money set aside. Maybe grandma and grandpa are going to cover that. So make sure that you're taking those out. Look at the bill and say, okay, what do I really need to pay here? And just make sure that you're borrowing that amount. Again, thinking about what might be ending so that you can reduce it. But also when you're thinking about what you're borrowing, ask yourself a question. If I can't afford this today, will I be able to afford to make these payments in 5 years? What's likely to change? And for some families, the answer may be nothing. Nothing's going to change and I can't afford it in 5 years. So you want to be really careful about the amount you're borrowing. You also want to think about how many more kids are coming up behind. I think we forget about those other 1, 2, 3, 4 kids that are going to come. And, if you borrow for one, you kind of have to borrow for the others because kids' favorite 4-letter word is fair. And so if you say, okay, well, I borrowed for your sister, but I'm not borrowing for you. Hey, it's not fair. So thinking about how many kids you need to educate. I once had a conversation with a dad and he started by saying to me, I have 5 children. I need to cover X number of years of school, and I'm going to borrow $20,000 a year. And I said, okay, that's $400,000 that you'll need to borrow. And he just went silent because he had never thought of it that way. $20,000 a year might seem reasonable enough, but when you add it up, $400,000 is a lot of money.
It's an incredible amount of money, and it's probably a chunk of money that some people might really, really struggle to pay back, and also that can prevent, that's money that maybe you could have used to retire at a reasonable age.
Oh, totally.
Right? It's right. You really do have to weigh the amount of money that you're borrowing against. We want to give our children things, but we don't want to saddle them with debt, and we don't want to
Mm-hmm.
saddle ourselves with debt,
Right.
especially because there are more reasonable options out
Mm-hmm.
there. So, of
And
course,
I
it's
always
tricky
encourage,
if, sorry.
okay, encourage people to think about how old they'll be when this process is done. You
Hmm.
know, if you're going to be 52 or 55 when all your kids are out of school, you probably have several years of working left. But if you're going to be 62 or 65 or a little older, do you want to be carrying this debt into retirement? Probably not.
Right, right. So when we think about who is doing the borrowing, so we've cautioned against borrowing too much and not thinking about how much ultimately you will borrow, because what you borrow this year, you're going to likely have to do again for the next 3 years. And like you say, you may have to do that for every single child. So do the addition, add it up.
Mhm.
But now you've determined, okay, I am going to borrow some money. I'm going to try not to borrow too much. Who is the borrower? Is it the student? Is it the parent?
Yeah. So I always encourage families to really have their student max out their student loan, federal student loan eligibility, which isn't huge. People are always surprised to find out how modest the loan limits are. You know, it's $5,500 for a freshman, $6,500 for a sophomore, $7,500 for juniors and seniors. But the interest rates are always lower. It's always going to be in your student's name. You're not going to be responsible for that loan, and they can defer that loan while they're in school. And this year, I've been in financial aid for so many years, since 1993. All right, I'm coming clean, I'll be honest. And this is the lowest interest rate I've ever seen. It's 2.75 for a student loan this year. That's amazing.
Hmm.
Almost makes me want to go back to school.
Yeah.
So, you know, have your student max out their eligibility. Often a parent will say to me, you know, I don't want my student to borrow, but it doesn't make sense. If you want to repay it later, go for it. But it
Right.
doesn't make sense to borrow more at a higher interest rate and leave that lower interest rate on the table.
Exactly. So if what you need is what your child can afford, or what your child is eligible to borrow, why wouldn't you do it all that way?
Hmm.
And then, like you say, you can pay it off. There's nothing
Right.
going to prevent you from writing the check to pay it off,
Exactly.
but it's just going to be at a lower interest rate, and it's not going to be in your name, so that eventually, if you are not going to pay it off, it will be your student's responsibility, and
Right.
it's their education. So that
Hmm.
seems to make sense as well.
There are also federal parent loans, and that is the parent that's the borrower. That can never be transferred to the student. Lots of parents say, well, my student will be paying that off. Great. But you can't change the name on that. So you're going to have to work out an arrangement, you know, share some sort of an account where the money is coming out every month so you can see, and that's not hurting your credit rating if your kid can't make the payment on time.
Right.
The only way to get that out of your name is to potentially refinance that out of a federal loan and into a private loan at some point down the road after graduation, when your student is maybe a little bit stronger financially and has a credit history, so they can get a decent interest rate. And then many parents say, you know, I don't want to be on the loan at all. I'm going to have my student borrow through a private education loan. Okay, your student will be the borrower, but since about 2010, you have not been able to borrow those, students have not been able to borrow those loans without a cosigner.
Yeah.
So who's that? It's usually going to be a parent. And so that does link you to the loan. You know, you have to be careful. I think people are cavalier about co-signing loans, but you're on the hook if something happens, if the student can't make the payments, if they're paying late, that's going to hurt your credit. So, you know, I think parents really need to be aware of what they're borrowing, who's responsible, are we both responsible, or only I? And to think about the ramifications, not only, you know, how old will you be and what do you want to do, but, you know, will your student, the social worker, be able to pay $100,000 in student loans when they graduate, you know, yours plus their own?
Right.
So,
Well, and the other thing I think about too is, think about it. You're co-signing a loan with a person who, in many cases, has not worked before, or perhaps only worked a part-time job.
right.
You know, they don't really understand often what it means to borrow that much money. What they understand is that this is the school they really want to attend,
Yes.
and
Hmm.
it looks like it's going to be the most fun, or in theory it has the best program, but you have no idea how it's going to go. Are they going to actually like it? Are they going to do that program that guarantees the high paying job when they
Yes.
get out? Are they going to graduate into an economy that's like this one, or like
Yes.
another? Right? These are important things to
Hmm.
be thinking about. And you may have one of those kids who is super responsible, and together you're going to work collaboratively, and it's going to get paid off, and it isn't going to hurt your credit, and you're not going to have any issues. But there are oftentimes
Right,
challenges, you know,
right,
so to
right.
ignore that that's a possibility is to do so at your own peril, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
In terms of those interest rates when you borrow, are they
Hmm.
fixed? Are they variable? What kind
Right.
of, what are you getting yourself into?
Good. Good question. That's a question everybody should be asking.
Yes.
So, with federal student loans, they're going to be fixed for that loan. So, for
Hmm.
example, if a student is borrowing a loan in the upcoming school year, it'll always be at 2.75. But if they borrow a loan in the following school year, it will have a different interest rate because it's reset every year. A student loan through the feds can never go higher than 6.8%. So you're pretty much certain that, that's going to be as high as it goes. But you'll know that before you borrow the loan. And if, maybe there's going to be a year where you say, not happy with that interest rate. Parent Plus loans could go as high as 10%, 10.5%, I think it is. And that's pretty high. And they
Yeah.
have a 4% origination fee. Now, to clarify, they haven't been that high for, they've never really been higher than 8.25 for the past 10 years, but it doesn't mean that's not what they could go to. Some families choose to borrow private education loans and they're seduced by that really low variable interest rate,
Sure.
2.75 or something. And they're like, oh, wow, this is amazing. Two things about that. I rarely see anyone getting the interest rate that low because the student is the primary borrower. And as you said, they have no work history, no credit
Right.
history, no way to repay the loan. So the loan rates tend to be significantly higher than that. And if you do a variable and it starts out low, but the repayment term is 15 years, is there a cap on that loan? What will it cap out at? I recently worked with a borrower who had a 12.75% private loan interest rate.
Yeesh.
Yeah, scary, huh?
Yeah, that is
And they
scary.
were able to refinance that because they had good credit and a job, and they were able to get it down to about 6%. So really great. But again, there's so many ifs.
Right. What if that doesn't describe you too,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
So yeah, that is a little scary. So be careful of that.
Yes.
Um, what are some other tips that you would offer to families who are thinking about borrowing right now? I know there's a loan calculator that
Yes.
they can be looking at. Tell us more about that.
Yeah. So there are lots of loan calculators out there. Many loan lenders have them right on their websites. Bankrate has them. Magnify Money has them. So you can go on there and get an idea. Like if you think you're going to borrow 20,000 a year and the interest rate, use the max. If it's a variable rate, use what the max is going to be. Always, kind of think worst case, just in
Sure.
case it turns out that way. And figure out what those monthly payments will look like, especially if the student will be the borrower. um, you know, as I said, a lot of times someone will say, well, my student's going to be an engineer, and so they're going to start at 75,000. Yeah, if they continue with the engineering program,
Right.
one, and also if they, can make those payments, even if they're making 75,000, if their debt is 100 and they're going to live in a high cost of living area, it's going to be extremely difficult to start out that way. It's, akin to a mortgage payment or more.
Right.
So really thinking about what the career path is. In a college coach, we often talk about, if your child doesn't have a particular major in mind, then try to keep it to the federal student loan limit, which is about $30,000 for an undergrad. Because no matter what you're doing, you should be able to make the payments either, on a standard 10-year repayment or using an income dependent repayment plan. So if you're making very little or not working, your
Hmm.
payment will be zero, but you're still considered in repayment. So you're not
Right.
hurting your credit. So yeah, I think it's really important to check what your monthly payment is. And again, to be thinking about the whole big picture. How many kids here? How much do we think we're gonna have to borrow?
Yep, absolutely. And I also think going back to the loan calculator piece, just showing someone, namely your teenager and maybe yourself sometimes in black and white, what that payment is actually going to look like,
Yeah.
and thinking about, okay, you wanted to move to Manhattan after you
Mm-hmm.
graduated. Let's look at how much money you can anticipate paying for an apartment if,
Right.
say, you have three other roommates,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe that's where you have to go in order to get that job that pays you $75,000. But also, how much money you're going to be spending on groceries? How much money can you expect to spend when you're going out to eat? And how much is left now for you to make this
Mm-hmm.
astronomical payment that you
Yeah.
have to make on your loan? Oh, not only is there no money left for that, but you're actually going to be going further into debt to
Right.
do anything else that's fun.
Mhm.
And, that can be a fairly stark thing. And maybe for you, you'd rather go to that school and then live at home after you graduate, if your family will allow that.
Yeah.
Not a policy we have at my house. Once you go to college,
See
you're
ya.
off into the world, right?
Yeah,
So,
right.
and that's that sort of really thinking about it. What does this really mean? We do hear that sometimes. Like, I didn't realize what I was doing.
Mhm.
And, I sort of appreciate that, especially if this is new for everyone in the family. But at the same time, I don't think, before you sign on the dotted line and you take that much debt out, you really owe it to yourself to think about what it really is going to mean for you,
Mhm.
and for your future. So,
I think if any of our listeners have younger students like 9th, 10th, 11th grade, have what I call the conversation. Talk about what you can afford and what they should be thinking about borrowing and how they can help out with this whole process by working or looking for scholarships so that you don't have to get in debt. And really not to be afraid to say to your student, I can't co-sign for you because this is a bad thing for you. This is a
yeah,
bad thing for your future. You have the power. Parents do. I think a lot of parents feel like they want to make their kids' dreams come true. And I get that. I have kids.
sure.
So
Me
I've
too.
been there. I do. I've been
Yeah.
there. So, but not at your financial peril.
Yeah.
So
Or
yeah,
theirs, even more
the
importantly,
whole
right?
family. Right. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Jean, thank you so much for joining today. I
Oh,
really
you're
appreciate
welcome.
it.
Nice to see you.
You too.
Take
But
care.
we're going to take a really quick break. And when we come back, my colleague Kenan is going to share his postgraduate study experience with us. So don't go away.